So there's flyers at the check-in desk if you want to sign up. It's $36 per person. I think that's right. Yes. Again, we need your reservation so we know how many meals to order, okay? The deadline for that will be March 3rd, for the March 10th Shabbat dinner and Rimonim. And the Rimonim is a musical fun service in this room. We look forward to everybody joining. The docent tour, the private docent tour for the Skirball, which is on the 22nd of February, is sold out now. So we have everybody who signed up. We're just taking a waiting list, and if by chance somebody has to cancel, we've got a backup for them. But that's sort of exciting. And one other thing we're considering, is Candy here? Yeah. We're interested in, there's some of you are interested in restarting a gaming day or a gaming time. Candace, did you want to say anything about that right now? Okay, if you are interested, and we have, whether it's backgammon or mahjong or poker or whatever, let me or Candy know today so that we can get back in touch with you. If there's a number of us who are interested, we can get the space and the time, and people can get together, okay? So with that, why don't we start the recording? Okay. So refugees, asylum seekers, and what is really going on at our southern border. We have Joe Goldman with us today, and Joe is the Community Engagement Director for the Western region at HIAS, the world's oldest and only Jewish international humanitarian agency serving refugees and asylum seekers of all backgrounds. Before joining HIAS, Joe worked at Mazon, Jewish Response to Hunger, the San Francisco-based Jewish Community Relations Council, and he began his career working on several political campaigns. Joe holds a BA in Political Communication and a Master's of Political Management from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And Joe, we're really excited about having you here today. Timely and interesting topic in this world we have. So welcome.
Thank you, Joel, and Boker Tov, everyone. Good morning, and good morning to everyone on Zoom. Before I start talking, I wanted to show a very short video that helps introduce HIAS, which may be familiar to many of you, but also, the overall issue. I think it's a great way to help set the tone to get us started. So hopefully I can get the technology to work. Apologies in advance if I can't, but I'm not the best millennial technology, but I think we got it. Could be as simple as just hitting play. Not as simple.
These places have many names because there are places where being who you are is a punishable offense. There are places where you might be sentenced to death because you chose to live. These places have many names, but the ones who flee have one: refugee. And it is in the name of the refugee that HIAS has dedicated itself for the last 130 years. Created in the name of the Jewish people, for the Jews who fled Tsarist Russia and Soviet Russia, the Jews who fled the death camps of Europe, the Jews exiled from places as varied as Algeria and Cuba and Iran. 4.5 million rescued and resettled so far. When they said, "Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," we were the ones at the docks helping them breathe free. And we are still at the docks and the deserts and the cities and camps and lands where people no longer have a home in their homeland. Only now it's a farmer from Darfur, a shop owner from Syria, a family from Ukraine, A child from Colombia, a Christian from Iran, a gay man from Uganda. The 60 million souls who still wander the earth in search of sanctuary. Why? Maybe it's because being Jewish means you don't have to be reminded never to forget. Maybe it's because we are called in our most sacred texts to love the stranger. Or maybe it's because as long as there are still places it is a crime to be who you are, there is still a mandate for us to be who we are. HIAS, for the refugee.
Thank you. I always enjoy starting a lot of conversations with this video, even though it was produced in 2015. Everything is the same except the number of refugees, which is more than 100 million now. So in 8 years, we've seen almost a double in those numbers. So, if you think about it, there are more refugees now than after World War II. I mean, it's a really staggering number. And for this conversation, a lot of what I'm going to focus on while helping understand refugees and asylum seekers and what's happening at our border, I'm really going to bring in the Jewish side to all of this, because especially not just because we're at a synagogue, but because it's really a part of the whole history behind the entire resettlement system. And you'll understand why as we go through this conversation. So HIAS provides refugees, asylum seekers, and other forcibly displaced people access to food, psychosocial support, medicine, shelter, economic empowerment, legal representation, and prevention of gender-based and anti-LGBTQ violence in over 22 countries across 5 continents. Last year, we served over 1 million people. We're supporting Darfuri refugee communities who are devastated by floods in Chad, helping asylum seekers build new lives in over half of Latin America and the Caribbean. Our teams in Europe are mobilizing the continent's Jewish community to fight anti-refugee xenophobia. We're fighting to get climate refugees the same recognition as those fleeing persecution. And we're raising funds to address the crisis response for millions of people displaced, and many of them refugees, by the devastating earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. And we're advocating for fair treatment of asylum seekers at our own borders and ports of entry. But let's be real, our work is not happening in a vacuum. Overt anti-Semitism from a former and potential future president, alongside many other elected officials, tech billionaires, and celebrities, as well as fulfilled and unfulfilled violent attacks against Jews, are taking place over the last 4 years and 5 years or more, and it's nothing short of alarming. Throw in attacks on access to abortion and gender-affirming care, the climate crisis, or well-organized assaults on the institutions that keep our fragile liberal democracies functioning in both the United States and Israel. It could be exceedingly difficult for many of us in the Jewish world to fathom, how could we possibly manage to welcome the stranger when we have so much to take care of in our own homes? Remember, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was explicitly targeted by white supremacists because it was holding a HIAS refugee Shabbat. He believed in the Great Replacement theory, that all Jews are somehow in a cabal working together to dilute America's white majority to take over the country's levers of power. That anti-Semitism sits squarely in the Venn diagram of those who oppose welcoming refugees, who claim that LGBTQ people like me are groomers, and continue to allow access to the guns used everywhere from Pittsburgh to Colorado Springs to El Paso to Buffalo and beyond. But let me be very clear. We at HIAS are proud to be the worst nightmare of anti-Semites, authoritarians, and other bigots among us. We're the Jews and allies fighting every single day to welcome the stranger and contributing to the pluralistic democracy that has long kept Jews safe. In fact, we just kicked off the 5th annual Refugee Shabbat. And in just 5 years, we've gone from a program that never existed before to over 437 organizations and congregations across 5 continents observing it. Those anti-Semites are never going to stop us. Now, I remember the latest that my own family arrived in America. It was 1907, when my great-great-grandmother, Dinah Waller, reached the United States after fleeing pogroms in her native Vilna. She arrived at a time in which she had no right to vote and had no right to control her own body. She was considered white enough to immigrate here, but not white enough to avoid widespread anti-Semitic discrimination that makes today's unacceptable reality seem much easier, like a walk in the park. And she moved to a country where the state terrorized the lives of millions of people through Jim Crow and was still implementing some of the most egregious stages of genocidal actions against Native Americans. In short, like Jews for generations, Dinah was a stranger in a strange land. Despite living in another time and dimension that is alien to all of us today, Dinah and her peers and the generations that followed them persevered. They, the descendants of refugees and immigrants, alongside those of former slaves and indigenous communities, fought for change in ways to make the idea of America far more real than it was when Dinah first arrived. They've gone through 2 world wars, domestic upheavals, and participated in the fights for and experienced the backlashes against the gains achieved by Jews, people of color, women, and LGBTQ people. And it's worth noting, there are millions of Jews who are women, people of color, and LGBTQ. Today's refugees are our future leaders. We owe it not just to them, but to ourselves to sustain and expand the policies that welcome the stranger. Too often in the Jewish community, we come up against a very false binary that we must choose between the particular and the universal, that somehow fighting for Jewish values that may benefit non-Jews is contradictory to fighting for Jews ourselves. I've been in rooms right here in LA where major Jewish community leaders flat out say, if it's not helping Jews, it's not Jewish, period. HIAS confronts this dynamic every single day. Roughly 20 years ago, a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, global Jewry reached a point in which the vast majority of Jews lived in countries where they had freedom of movement. Not freedom from anti-Semitism or economic challenges, that's very real today, but the fundamental freedom to move to another place if necessary for safety. Israel's establishment also accelerated that reality, empowering HIAS to offer Jews multiple avenues for refuge. Instead of shutting our doors, the UN and the State Department encouraged us to lean into our deep experience as an agency that resettled over 4 million people worldwide to be a Jewish agency working on behalf of people of all backgrounds. Today we say, we helped refugees because they were Jewish, and today we help refugees because we are Jewish, as you heard in the video. There are some who claim that Jews must only care for themselves or ourselves because we're in a world full of people who hate us. Taking important lessons of the necessity of communal safety and self-determination and self-defense from the Holocaust and Zionism, but to a whole new extreme. On the other end of the spectrum, there are folks who argue that because of our remarkable success as a community in this country and in Israel, it's unnecessary or even offensive to stand up for our own Jewish-specific concerns. Neither perspective squares with the lived experiences and worldviews held by most American Jews. Local and national studies show that between 75 to 80% of American Jews view social justice and equity as very important to how they build and express their Jewish identity, and that's over 20% higher than almost any other aspect of Jewish life. Refugee policy shows us that there's no need to choose, that the binary between the particular and the universal is false. In fact, refugee policy keeps Jews safe and allows us to thrive. The global refugee resettlement system was established under the 1951 UN Geneva Convention in direct response to what happened to Jews after the Shoah. After witnessing the consequences of denying Jews a safe and legal means to seek refuge elsewhere, the international community came together to make sure that it never happens again. Both America and Israel are signatories of this treaty, and even though both governments, alongside many others, often fail to uphold their own obligations under the treaty, it's a matter of historic Jewish safety and prosperity nonetheless. Think about it. The UN, an institution with an extremely complicated history in the Jewish world, and that's putting it as diplomatically as I can, it set forth the entire resettlement system with direct input from religiously observant Jews who had just survived the Holocaust. That is remarkable. And LA Jewish life alone would be unrecognizable if not for refugee policy. Think of the hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors, Jews from the former Soviet Union and Iran, and Israelis, many of whom were former or descended from refugees themselves before coming to America, who all make California home. I mean, here we are in Encino. Encino would not be Encino if not for refugee policy. Think of the countless contributions to our communal vitality, to our state's economy, our culture, and politics from Jewish and non-Jewish refugees that have benefited us beyond comprehension. We are so much stronger as a community because of refugee policies that welcome not just the Jewish stranger, but all strangers seeking refuge. Though HIAS is global, Ukraine remains at the heart of our agency's existence. Refugees fleeing the 1881 state-sanctioned pogroms in what is now Kyiv sparked HIAS's creation in the first place. We've gone on to help people flee pogroms, Nazis, and Soviets in Ukraine. In fact, you heard the poem from Emma Lazarus in the video, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, that's on the Statue of Liberty. She was a full-time volunteer with us when she wrote that poem. And it was mostly in response to what was happening in Ukraine. And so even after helping people flee that country for so long, we later opened an office in Ukraine itself after the collapse of the former Soviet Union to assist with immigration, as well as to represent people who were seeking refuge in the country from the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. And we went on to serve those who were forcibly displaced within Ukraine, particularly by Putin's first invasion of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk in 2014. And today we have a staff of over 80 people operating to serve those displaced by this current war. Ukraine is called Ukraina in both Ukrainian and Russian, and it means borderland. Yes, geopolitically, it means the borderland of many different empires that ruled over it, from Russians to Poles, to back to Russians, then Soviets, then Nazis, then Soviets again. It's also the borderland of fragile democracy and authoritarianism. Just as Israel translates to struggle with God, I see another meaning for Ukraine, for the Jewish community today. We are confronting the borderlands of our own emotional and intellectual challenges as Jews, of recognizing the need to stand up for our own people and for others, especially because Ukraine is home to the 7th largest Jewish community in the world. We're at the borderlands of the universalist and particularistic experiences that shape our history, culture, and values. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, the Jewish grandson of a Holocaust survivor, lives both literally and figuratively in those borderlands. As a Jew, I take considerable pride in Zelensky fighting for his own diaspora country, proving that we Jews, despite it all, can at times be accepted by billions around the globe and inspire fear in authoritarian dictators. If Zelensky can fight for Ukrainians of all backgrounds, of Jews and of non-Jews, then so can we. And we can apply that same tenacity not just to Ukrainian refugees, but refugees the world over. I'll get back to Ukraine in a bit, but I speak to you at a time in which the United States is rebuilding the refugee resettlement system. Let's take a moment to set some basic definitions in history, and I promise not to quiz you later. I know you have a long day ahead of you of many different, very interesting topics. So, refugees. Refugees are people who are forcibly displaced based on identity, political views, and other characteristics who have crossed an international border and are designated as refugees by the UN. Most refugees stay in the countries they initially flee to. Less than 1% will get resettled anywhere in the OECD, in the rich world. So if you think about that 100 million, less than 1% of them will ever reach not just the United States, but literally any of the wealthy countries that are among our peers. And in order to be approved for resettlement in the United States, it often takes up to 18 months of background checks from the State Department, Department of Justice, and Department of Homeland Security. Once refugees arrive, they're eligible for certain benefits like SNAP and TANF and Medicaid, and on our pathway to permanency to build and restart their lives. HIAS is one of 10 agencies working with the State Department for refugee resettlement, and we have a network of 26 resettlement partners, usually JFS agencies, who resettle HIAS-designated clients across the country. Asylum seekers are in many ways identical to refugees, except they must physically be in the country they're seeking refuge in and have their cases adjudicated after their arrival. This system was created this way because many times people don't have the luxury of time when needing to flee. However, our immigration courts are underfunded and under exclusive control by the executive branch, and so cases at times can take many years to be adjudicated. We'll discuss asylum seekers more, but it's an important distinction to understand as I mentioned both of these different populations. Our refugee resettlement system was gutted under the previous administration. In the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year, we welcomed only 11,000 refugees, which is down from a bipartisan average of 95,000. And that was out of an average of, before the last administration, we naturalized roughly 1 million immigrants every year. So it's a teeny tiny number, even when we had the high numbers of refugees welcomed. In fact, under the previous administration, we had to shut down our local partnership in LA County. Hundreds of Jews and other religious minorities trying to flee places like Iran were denied refuge because of the previous administration's Muslim ban, and that included members of my own extended family. We now have an ostensibly pro-refugee administration, which reset refugee admissions to 125,000 for the new fiscal year that was supposed to start October 1st, 2021. So we're already talking 2 Octobers ago, which meant that critical funding would be released to NGOs like HIAS and our local resettlement partners across the country to hire case managers, social workers, translators, and others in the public-private partnership that defines refugee resettlement. And we thought we'd even have a shot at restarting resettlement in LA County in 2021. We thought we could go off into the sunset, rebuild the system, and somehow live happily ever after, right? Except that is so not what happened. Kabul fell mid-August 2021, 6 weeks before the new federal fiscal year. And the administration, as we all witnessed, did not have an evacuation plan. Remember, a resettlement agency typically has a lead time of at least 10 days to 3 weeks before new clients arrive to help find housing and get everything in order for these folks. But when 76,000 arrived all at once, the system was in shock. HIAS sprang into action. We mobilized supporters nationwide to push Congress and the Biden administration to financially support resettlement like any other refugee group, because so many of these folks hadn't been processed in the same conventional way as other refugees. And we also directed our substantial network of activists and supporters at congregations and elsewhere to donate to and volunteer with our resettlement partners. And for cities like LA that haven't had a resettlement partner, we launched HIAS Welcome Circles to help lessen the strain on the system. And it was modeled on the successful private sponsorship programs that are used in Canada to welcome over half of their refugees. Groups of 5 to 8 core volunteers would form mini agencies to anchor usually anchored at a local Jewish agency to assist with finding housing and enrolling in health insurance, schools, and vocational training, and so much more. And since these folks were ineligible for federal funding, all Welcome Circles raised their own money, which was to be kept in-house, not given to HIAS, to help resettle refugees over a 6-month period. Of the 32 Welcome Circles that were formed across the country for Afghans, 14 were right here in Southern California. The Jewish community really stepped up to rise to the occasion for this groundbreaking pilot program that was launched in the midst of a crisis. And then, just 6 months after Kabul fell, we faced another refugee crisis: Ukraine. Within days of the invasion, our staff in Ukraine had to relocate to safer regions, and they were serving other displaced people while they were displaced themselves. And also, we opened new offices and partnerships in Poland, Romania, Moldova, and Slovakia. And that's not even counting the operations that we have in Brussels for our work across the EU. Though the vast majority of Ukrainian refugees will remain in Europe, HIAS advocated for the US to engage in responsibility sharing to at least welcome some Ukrainians. So 2 months after the war began, the Biden administration announced Uniting for Ukraine, a private sponsorship model allowing for Ukrainian nationals to come to the United States. Practically speaking, the process is intended for people to have speedy entry, but people will only be granted temporary humanitarian parole rather than permanent status. They will have to apply for asylum for any chance at permanent residency. Ukrainians may want to go home quickly, but unfortunately, that may not be possible for a very long time. We know this firsthand. Our staff in Ukraine works in between regular shelling and loss of power. Even those who have returned to Ukraine are mostly staying in the country's western regions, away from the southern and eastern focal points of the war, where entire cities and towns have been destroyed. Social and economic challenges, especially an acute housing shortage, dampen abilities for Ukrainians to stay. Lack of access to heat in the bitter cold months jeopardizes the ability for Ukrainians to remain as well. The war risks taking a turn for the worse as Putin seeks to regain lost territory before the 1-year anniversary later this month by wielding a massive offensive in eastern Ukraine as we speak. Fortunately, communities across the country are forming welcome circles to support Ukrainian newcomers just as they did for Afghans. We now have a total of, I believe we just got some new numbers, so I'm trying to do some math, but it's looking like 88 welcome circles who have helped well over 300 Afghans and Ukrainians total. And that's not even counting the tens of thousands from both communities receiving support from our conventional resettlement partners. Our Welcome Circle program was such a success that the Biden administration just announced the Welcome Corps, making private sponsorship a permanent part of refugee resettlement for refugees from around the world, not just Afghanistan and Ukraine. And there's even more exciting news for LA County. We're finally rebuilding the resettlement system with Jewish Family and Children's Services of Long Beach, which is applying to the State Department to bring back HIAS resettlement to both LA and Orange counties, and they have a 100-mile radius, so they will be resettling folks much closer here to the VBS community, not just down south by Long Beach. The Jewish movement for refugees isn't just active in the United States, but is also mobilizing in Israel. The country gets to the heart and the challenge of the balancing of the particular and universal of Jewish experience, safety, and prosperity. Israel's my home away from home. It's a nation I visited 8 times in the last 14 years. I had family in Givatayim for 25 years, and another cousin just made Aliyah to Tel Aviv last year. I'm a lifelong advocate for 2 states or 2 peoples, and I professionally fought BDS in the Bay Area for half a decade and staffed many civic delegations to the region. And remember, HIAS proudly helped establish Israel by resettling millions of Jewish refugees during every wave of Aliyah, even those preceding the country's independence in 1948. It's home to HIAS's longest-running foreign country office. We've held operations there since 1950. For those who may not be as familiar, Israel is home to upwards of 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union, and hundreds of thousands of them have non-Jewish spouses on a proportional basis very similar to American Jews. All these people moved to Israel under the law of return. Naturally, there are thousands of non-Jewish Ukrainians and Russians who fled to the only other place on earth where they have family. And thanks to my colleagues who mobilized new legions of pro bono attorneys from Israel's flourishing tech industry, HIAS has led a successful impact litigation effort to ensure that those who seek safety in Israel with family and friends can do so. The threats against Israeli democracy under this new government risks irreparably harming the people HIAS serves. Removing judicial independence, a cornerstone of any self-respecting democracy, means gutting access to the primary system in which we can seek recourse for asylum seekers in Israel. And this is, by the way, a huge criticism even domestically here in the United States that we have of our immigration court system, because they are not part of the conventional judicial system. But these efforts risk torpedoing the golden goose of the tech industry that is the backbone of the startup nation's economy and can also destroy much of the gains made by LGBTQ Israelis. Coalition members Avi Maoz, Bezalel Smotrich, and Itamar Ben-Gvir seek to change the law of return by gutting the right of grandchildren of Jews to immigrate to Israel, as well as seek to deny Aliyah, a non-Orthodox conversion, both of which disproportionately harm Jews and their families fleeing Ukraine and Russia, ironically putting self-identified Jews in a position in which they have nowhere to go. HIAS Israel's efforts on behalf of Jewish Olim from the former Soviet Union, vulnerable populations of non-Jewish Ukrainian and Russian refugees, as well as asylum seekers from Eritrea and Sudan, and openly LGBTQ people from the West Bank continue to get to the heart of navigating those borderlands that I've mentioned earlier, of the particular and the universal, in an Israel that lives up to the Zionist dream of a safe and welcoming Jewish democracy. But I think that if HIAS and our partners can find that right balance of our aspirations in Israel, along with many other organizations, in a country that is facing existential threats from within and profound geopolitical challenges in its tough neighborhood that can make some of our own very scary problems in America feel like nothing, then you bet we could do it here in the United States and around the world. Now, here we are in California, so of course I'm going to talk about the border. It's in the title of the program. While President Biden beautifully spoke about the right to seek asylum, how it was established after 6 million Jews perished in the Shoah, his administration's actions do not match his words. On January 5th, the administration implemented an asylum ban on foreign nationals from virtually the entire Western Hemisphere, preventing individuals from receiving asylum if they traveled through a third country where they did not request protection first. The Biden administration also expanded Title 42, a World War II public health law invoked in March 2020 to deny the right to seek asylum under the guise of stopping the spread of COVID-19, resulting in over 2.2 million expulsions across both administrations. The Biden administration also announced a new humanitarian parole program for some countries like Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba, and Venezuela, but with very limited numbers. And they basically are temporary stays that result not just in a de facto wealth test, but also deny participants the right to seek asylum or any path to permanency in the United States whatsoever. HIAS resettlement partner JFS of San Diego is on the front lines of this effort. We subsidize their legal team to represent asylum seekers in court, and JFS San Diego is also the lead agency of the groundbreaking San Diego Rapid Response Network, demonstrating how to properly manage influxes of newcomers and helping them reach their destinations across the country in humane and welcoming ways in a crazy topsy-turvy world of ever-changing immigration laws under different administrations. I look forward to staffing a delegation of rabbis at their facilities. We have a group of rabbis from South Florida coming next month, where we're going to meet with folks from JFS San Diego, as well as my colleagues in the HIAS Tijuana office. HIAS has 13 offices and counting in Mexico. To be very clear though, HIAS will never advocate for open borders. All we're asking for is a just system for those who are fleeing persecution, war, and displacement to have their cases heard and be able to potentially start new lives. We strive for our country to do so without caving into the political, or dare I even say racist, fears of when we see any number of Black and brown people trying to exercise their legal right to seek asylum at our border. As Jews, we know the devastating consequences of denying the right to asylum all too well. People who are coming to our border to seek asylum are making desperate, dangerous decisions to risk their lives. Imagine how bad life at home must be before you send your 6-year-old ahead of you in a dangerous jungle with a stranger. Or how bad things must be before you're willing to climb a 35-foot wall and from which you could fall and die. And with new policies coming from the Biden administration, we will only see an increase in people taking serious risks that can lead to more deaths instead of refuge. Let's not wait for media and political hysteria that whips people into a total frenzy over people showing up at our border. Instead, we need to advocate for a functioning asylum process instead of haphazard deterrence measures. But while these tasks ahead of us feel enormous, there's a lot we can do, and I invite all of you in the VBS community to join us. Here are ways to help. First, join HIAS in asking the Biden administration not to implement further restrictions on asylum. Second, I hope VBS will join the Welcome to Congress campaign to make sure that the brand new 118th Congress hears the deep support of the Jewish community for refugees and asylum seekers and feels the pressure to take action. This is a very tangible way to make an impact. Even if you think that members of Congress are pro-refugee, pro-immigration, all that stuff, a lot of them don't realize just how important it is to their constituents. And while states don't set refugee numbers, that's up to the president, they do have control over what kind of welcome refugees have once they're here. And so that's why HIAS is the lead organizational sponsor for the California Extended Case Management Act, SB 85, legislation that would dramatically improve outcomes for our new refugee neighbors and save us tax dollars by doubling case management access from the federally subsidized 90 days to a minimum of 180. So basically taken from 3 months to 6 months. And to that end, I hope that you will join HIAS at the JPAC Capital Summit in Sacramento, that's May 9th and 10th, to lobby our lawmakers with Jewish community members from dozens of organizations statewide. The earthquake that struck Turkey and Syria devastated the lives of millions of refugees who have already suffered so much. I hope that you will join HIAS in supporting our crisis response. We are funding local partners on the ground, and that's all easily accessible at HIAS.org, where you can donate there. And then finally, our bargaining partners at JFCS Long Beach need your support. They need your help building out its new refugee resettlement program so that they could hit the ground running should there be approval on October 1st from the state, by October 1st for the State Department. And you can visit jfcslongbeach.org. So despite the many challenges ahead of us, and I know I shared so much information, I'm excited to have some Q&A with you, time for Q&A with all of you. And just remember this, welcoming the strangers who we are. Toda rabah.
Thank you. So yes, if you have any comments or questions, raise your hand. We have to use the microphone so the folks on Zoom can hear us. And if you are on Zoom and have a comment or question, type it into the chat room, and Brian at the back of the room here will get your question and be able to ask Joe. So let's start up front.
Has there been an estimate of the actual number of immigrants crossed the border in the last year, legal and illegal?
So I don't have all the exact numbers, and the question here, when people ask the question about legal versus illegal, it gets murky because you have people who are actually trying to seek asylum and they're unable to when they first arrive because of the current policies, and so they may fall under, the quote-unquote illegal. The number that I shared, the 2.2 million expulsions, what I don't know for that, and it gets to your question, is probably about a quarter of those are repeat people who have tried. And within that, probably about a third are those who are economic migrants who are not trying to seek asylum and have been deported. So the numbers, you see these numbers that go up and down. It looks like they say 1 million, but what they don't tell you are, how many of those were expelled or not. And so I don't have all that information, which I'm happy to look into. But the reality here is that also, when you have people, you have a country like Venezuela where like 6 million people have fled. They're not all coming to the United States. They're mostly going to Colombia, Chile, other parts of South America and Latin America. If things are that bad, even if they're willing to try to come here illegally because there's nothing else they could possibly do, it's also an indictment of our current immigration system that doesn't offer more pathways even for economic migrants. Even for now we have about less than 500,000 people who are being naturalized every year. And, our country needs more people. I know it's hard to believe being in LA because we're so congested and housing is expensive. But, my husband and I just got back from Japan, and they're about to go from a population of 124 million to about 87 million in like 20 years. And it's because they have a very, very strict view of what it means to be Japanese, what it means to be, in fact, they want tourists, but even in the nicest, most welcoming people, tourists are foreigners. You are called a foreigner, and it is very clear that you are here just to visit. And the consequences of the United States not having any immigration reform in the last 40 years at this point, it has, means that we have a declining population. All the any birth rate that we've seen or increase in population has been because of immigration. And so I'm going down that rabbit hole because I think it's very easy for us to just focus on like, who's crossing over and what's fair and what's this and that. And you're not wrong to raise that. But I think there's another context that we have to keep in mind when we ask those questions.
I think the idea I was asking, even if we admitted 3.5 million people, that's only 1% of our population. And I'm really disturbed that neither party has set up a procedure to admit that number. When I think back 100 years ago when my mother came over, and that number was probably 3 or 4% of the population at that time. In the 20s when they came by shiploads.
It's a very good point. And even when your mother came and my ancestors came, there were still very strict limitations. You could not just come here if you were coming from East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. And I think that the point about both parties, to be very blunt, this has anything and everything to do with race. And I can tell you the fact that we have made it way easier for Ukrainians to come here, even if we make it harder for them to stay, says everything. And I think both, if one party is very afraid, the other party, they're very afraid to do things, and the other party, unfortunately, despite having quite a robust history, actually, of supporting immigration, has also succumbed to very racialized politics.
I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but political reality.
Yeah.
Everything else be that as it may. We have significant wedge politics in the country today. The last presidential election was not a blowout. It was close. Now, with the border being a wedge issue that is being pushed by some, if there's not the limits, perhaps, that this current administration has put on, and the next election were to go a different direction, what would the consequence be of having somebody else in there who is not establishing the policies like the country's tried to establish now?
So just to make sure I understand, it's trying to understand what are the consequences if you have an even more anti-asylum person in power? Is that sort of in a new presidential election?
That would be the concluding end of it if
Yeah.
enough people see it as an issue,
Yeah.
pumped up, true, false, whatever the reason
Yeah.
may be.
It's a really good question to ask, and that's part of why we're asking people to do the Welcome to Congress campaign, because even though, look, it's a divided Congress, nothing, there are very few chances of anything actually happening. However, what is really important is folks like Brad Sherman, Ted Lieu, Adam Schiff, that is busy running for Senate, even though, again, they may vote in ways that suggest that they agree, at least with HIAS, on these issues, they don't always know just how much these issues matter to constituents. And part of that is how much noise do you make in support of these issues and systems? Because they do have influence with the administration, which at least the one that's currently in power that can set in motion certain policies, because at least you could build up something better that is a lot harder to tear down. Look, Trump tried to, with Stephen Miller, tried to completely destroy refugee resettlement in 4 years, and they did not succeed. They did not succeed, and that was not, and that is remarkable because in the Obama administration, there was no one in there thinking that anyone coming into office would actually try to target the most vulnerable immigrant populations ever. They didn't put in many fortifications to strengthen the system. Whereas now, part of the upside of, having things like this Welcome Corps, all these other programs that are coming in is we are creating, we're diversifying some of the options and ways to allow people to get here and seek refuge, although it's still a major shortcoming, but we are keeping in mind what could happen in 2024, which is try to build up as much as possible so that we're able to still, whether it's dealing, I'm tying together both asylum and the border and the refugee resettlement system because the people who hate one hate the other. There's like rarely much overlap in today's political reality. It allows us to, create more pathways for people to potentially seek safety and refuge. And again, the vast majority of people are still not going to be able to, even under this administration.
I have two short questions. One is, did you say that currently the Ukraine has the 7th largest Jewish population in the world existing? Are these people who identify as Jewish, or those people who had a grandfather or great-grandfather who was Jewish?
So as far as we know, it's at most a population of about 200,000 people. And we, and that's based on self-identification and different polls and studies. Unfortunately, there are some that would say, well, we should only count the halakhically Jewish people, so that would be 50,000. But at HIAS, for us, it's if you identify as Jewish, and by the way, that's about 200,000 out of a population of about pre-war 45 million people. So it's still a tiny number of people in this big country. But yes, it was, at least before the war, the 7th largest.
Are those people welcomed to Israel today?
They have not received necessarily the best welcome, particularly those who may be patrilineally Jewish or partnered with a Jew. When the war first started, they had separate lines at Ben Gurion Airport if you were a Jew or a non-Jew. They tried to deport also minors who were trying to reunite with loved ones who happened to not be Jewish but were in the country. It was a huge lost opportunity for Hasbara and to live up to what the country stands for.
So it's unresolved.
Yeah, things have gotten a lot better in the last few months, but it's still a big challenge.
So I have got 4 children. 3 of them live here, and the last one, it's taken a few years, and he's finally got his papers. His sons, who applied, could not get it right. The lawyers made mistakes as well, and now one is going to live in England, and one is going to live in Australia. So there's no family reunification here. They're all educated, and yet they cannot get into the United States with the whole family here already. So this is horrible. And also, what's the story with the dreamers who've been here all these years and have gone through universities even and are contributing? Okay, you have got an answer?
We have a fakakta system. It makes no sense. We let people come here as graduate students, we educate them, and then we ship them off. We say, oh, no, you can't stay. And this does come back to race. People are subconsciously or not subconsciously horrified at the idea of a non-white majority country. And the reality is most of the world is not white. That's okay. That is okay. And this directly impacts Jews. Like my cousin Johnny from Iran, his nephews, you can't bring them here because he's too distantly related. You can only, if you're lucky, maybe get a parent or a child here, or a spouse, and that's if you're lucky. His nephews have a PhD. One has a PhD in computer science. The other has a degree in mechanical engineering. I'm working with him to get his nephews out of Iran to Canada because getting to the United States is just too difficult. And you see the same dynamic, in terms of dreamers, because they're not just Latino. A lot of them are East Asian. A lot of people just think of them as mostly people, with Mexican parents, maybe born in Mexico. No, there's enormous diversity in the dreamer community, and we are forcing millions of people to live with profound uncertainty of how long they could be here. And so, and this is something that, assuming your family is Jewish, that also impacts Jews, and people don't realize that. And even though at HIAS we're focused on those who are seeking asylum or are refugees, it's part of the wider zeitgeist of the challenges in our immigration system that remain so profoundly broken. Yes, it does break families up.
Is Canada benefiting from the mess here? Do a lot of people like dreamers go to Canada?
Unfortunately, the one thing with Canada is they have very strict rules where basically if you try traveling, they do have their own sort of asylum ban, and that if you came through the United States and you didn't try seeking asylum here first, they're not gonna welcome you. But they do benefit from the fact that we have such restrictive immigration policies. So Canada, Australia, New Zealand, even the UK, despite its balagan post-Brexit, they've all benefited from the fact that more and more immigrants don't want to come here as their first choice. It's still the top destination. We're still #1 for all kinds of economic reasons, but particularly for higher educated people, who maybe have more affluence, who might be able to hire an attorney, or they have some, they're able to identify more options. They are increasingly looking to places like Canada, and we have some amazing partners there who we work with, both for refugees and asylum seekers. And in fact, we send people, particularly Palestinian, Eritrean, and Sudanese asylum seekers in Israel, who are all treated universally with contempt by the government. We have a whole third country program where most of those folks end up in Canada.
And I lived most of my life in Canada before coming to the US. So I'd just like to say Canada has a completely different immigration policy. They have a point system.
Yep.
So they're very selective in the immigrants that they choose to fit the needs of Canada. And it's very different. And of course, way back in the 1920s, they also shut their doors. And I was just listening to you talking so well. And I just thought that so many people don't really understand what happens when people have no place to go.
Yeah.
And maybe HIAS could make a film or something like that, or some educational program. What happens to people all over the world when you have no place to go? And of course, that happened in the Holocaust. But I'm not thinking that the stress should be on the Holocaust,
Right.
but on now. So just a suggestion. Takes money.
Thank you. Yes, and I appreciate the idea of what happens when there's nowhere else to go. And it's like, you don't want to wait for something like the Holocaust to happen. You need to act before something like the Holocaust happens. And it's hard for a lot of us in our community because we have collective trauma. as a community. And so there's sort of this, well, if it doesn't reach this threshold, it's not the same. How dare you bring this up? How dare you talk about this? And it's understandable. And it's how do we get beyond that, where it's not just about the Shoah, and you go from there.
One last question.
Well, I think it's so problematical. I don't know that people want to come here. I don't see that it's a safe place to necessarily come. But the country is dealing with homelessness, which is an additional problem. And so the problems are so vast that you can't consider one without thinking of the other. And I don't know how you feel about that.
I'm really glad you raised this. We live in California, which has a self-inflicted housing crisis. We also live in and I know I'm in Encino, so forgive me, but we live in a place where also we have an economy of supply and demand. If you do not build more housing of all kinds everywhere, we will continue to have a housing crisis. I used to live I'm an LA native, but I lived in San Francisco for many years. My husband and I left in part because we couldn't afford to stay. And we were doing both very well, but we couldn't see a future for us financially in the same way that we could here. And now we're seeing some of the same things happen here. And resistance to building anything but single-family homes on large lots is hurting my generation. And we are established people who live here and everything else. And so one of the things when I talk to communities where they don't have necessarily a resettlement agency in their area or whatnot, one of the things I talk about when they ask me, what can I do to help, especially because we have all these other crises going on here, I tell people, go to your planning commission meetings, go to your city council meetings, support building new housing. Adding apartments does not mean your neighborhood's gonna turn into Manhattan, I promise. And I know that that's tough and that's very touchy. I grew up in Pacific Palisades where they also resist a lot of building housing. But that's very, very relevant because also when I think about my cousin Johnny, he's trying to bring his family members from Iran, or when he helped Afghans, where the equivalent of Westwood and Encino for Afghans is Fremont and Hayward in the Bay Area, okay? How absurd is it for us to go and say, Fremont and Hayward are too expensive for you. You should go live in Oklahoma City. You'll be, yes, there's a great agency that will welcome you, but here are all the people who speak your language, who know what you've gone through, and they live in Fremont and Hayward, and you're not gonna have access to them. We can't, it's a both and conversation. And so I know I could go on and on with that, but it's something that I think I'm so glad someone raised the question of homelessness because it's so relevant to the refugee and immigration conversation.
Joe, thank you so much for being with us today, for helping us with this obviously complex conversation. Thank you very much, and keep up the good work with HIAS. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to take a short break and then come back at 11:15. 11:15. We're going to have our next speaker, who is Glenn Frankel.